Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this Kendall Hunt webinar, The Key to Promoting Critical Thinking Skills in Your Physiology Lectures. So what is this key to promoting critical thinking skills? Well, it's the concept of causality. The thing is, it's not enough to just simply mention causality in your lectures because it needs to be the bedrock of your explanations. Well, this might sound like rewriting into your entire course. Don't worry, there are some very specific, actionable things that you can start doing today to help make these concepts clear for your students. But before we get into that, I'm just going to cover a couple quick housekeeping points. This webinar is being recorded. You'll be receiving access to that in the coming days. And then if you have a question at all, feel free to enter that in either the chat or the Q&A functions, and we'll be addressing those at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our speakers for today. We've got Erik Silldorff with us and Jerry Robinson. Thank you both so much for being here. I'm excited to dive in.
Thanks, Megan. Appreciate the intro there. Welcome, everyone. I really appreciate you guys joining us live. And for anyone that's watching us later, we really appreciate that as well. I'm Erik Silldorff. I'll sort of be leading the discussion here. Jerry will be chiming in. I'm a professor of biology at Towson University, which is just outside Baltimore, Maryland. Been there for 26 years. And have been teaching all levels and versions of physiology for that entire time, basically. My friend and co-author, Jerry Robinson, is here with me. He was also at Towson University. He's now retired, professor emeritus there. And he's out in Oregon. And we've been working together for a long time and developing our thinking on how to teach physiology after many, many years of doing so, and really are just now sort of trying to share those ideas, the culmination of our experiences and what we've found works for us, and really just trying to share that with the broader public and group of physiology teachers out there. The image that I posted here of the dominoes falling is really helpful, I think, in thinking about the physiology that we're going to try to discuss here, right? We're trying to build these foundations for critical thinking. And what we're going to try to do today is get you to consider, or at least potentially consider shifting the way you focus your discussions, your lectures in physiology, towards something we found to be really exceptionally effective. And so we think of physiology as these sequences of events that occur, these what we like to call physiological cascades. And so the individual elements of that physiological cascade would be represented by the dominoes here. But really what you don't see are the actions that link those dominoes falling. And that's where we really want to shift the focus. We really want to point to and emphasize what's causing one domino to knock over the next within these physiological cascades. So why this focus on critical thinking, right? Like why make this an end goal of your teaching? And so really application of knowledge is really a crucial skill in any problem-solving career or in life in general, right? We want to generate students that have this ability to apply what they know. Within our discipline, there have been changes to physiology specifically, but this really applies across biology and probably some other related disciplines. But within biology and physiology specifically, there have been changes to the MCAT, the medical school admission test. There was in 2015, they revised the exam and they added a section called CARS, which is the critical analysis and reasoning skills, where students have to read a scientific passage, often including data, and they have to reason both within that information and also outside of it to answer questions. There have also been very recent changes to the NCLEX, which is the nursing licensure exam. And in that, the focus really is on clinical judgment and problem-solving skills. And really, this all is sort of related to these sort of higher order Bloom's level skills of, ability to analyze, ability to evaluate, ability to apply information. And what we're going to try to get at here is sort of like, well, what do students need to be able to do those things? It's one thing to say it, that's important, but how do you actually provide the students with the necessary tools to be able to do that? And then finally, there have been really broad calls for an altered approach to science education in general. Vision and Change was an initiative started in 2007, I believe, through NIH, partnering with HHMI and even NSF, I think, wherein a whole bunch of biologists got together and decided, well, what's important? And they came up with a series of core concepts and then competencies, which I like to just call skills, within, that are essential to effective education in a biological curriculum. And really, one of the keys to that is this idea of teaching students to think like a scientist. Well, to think like a scientist, students, this is just like inferring this same line of thinking. To think like a scientist, students need to be able to analyze, evaluate, and apply. And again, we're pulling this back to this idea of causality and what links our dominoes. And without an understanding of those linkages, they really are at a loss for those particular higher order cognitive skills, right? They just can't do them effectively, or most students can't, without that focus and that training on that particular component. So the question becomes like, well, aren't we all doing this already, right? Aren't we conveying that causality regularly? Well, I'm sure many are, but personal experience says no, not broadly. Jerry and I have been teaching for a long time, collectively, I don't know, Jerry, some scary number of years, 75 years or 70 years, something like that. And so, we've observed probably close to 100 different instructors giving their lectures, many of them in physiology. And some people are very good at conveying, the content of physiology sequentially and logically, but very few people provide what we're going to get to here in a moment, which is that the storytelling, the consistent employment of that causality that allows students to connect the dots and generate a deeper understanding of the content such that they can then apply that content in novel scenarios. And again, that's really our goal when you go outside of their educational scenario and they need to use this information. And so and really what supports what we find is sort of lacking in many cases is that many of the books out there, the digital tools are out there that are out there that students are using, that some courses are based upon, they're very content focused. Once again, they can be exceptionally good at delivering that content sequentially and accurately, but what they lack is a true explanation of the why, wherein students are able to fully comprehend why physiology is doing what it's doing, and then be able to employ that knowledge, that understanding in those novel scenarios. There's also data that shows that biology exams nationally are very content focused, right? So we talk about it, and the people that came out with Vision and Change have, are sort of pushing in. We've met with some of them at Towson University, and there's a little bit of you can feel this sort of, we came up with the solutions and you guys aren't buying it, right? Like you're not transitioning. So what we're trying to do is say, like, go to a deeper level and say, let's try to give the specific tools that allow people to execute on this particular element, right? It's one thing to say it. It's another thing to say, well, what does a student actually require? What do we need to deliver for them to walk away with that skill to think like a scientist? And then finally, discipline growth is just exponential, right? And so what are we going to do? Just keep teaching more and more and more? I had a colleague that brought this up when we met with those Vision and Change people, and I had brought up the idea that we can't just continue to teach more content. We shouldn't be teaching more content. That's like telling a history professor you have to teach all of history, right? They don't try to do that, right? And so we need to teach people think about history or think about biology and physiology. And that's really our goal. And so we need to we're in an era right now where we need to sort of, content will always be important, but we need to refocus and say, well, we can't teach them everything, so let's teach them how to think about anything within this particular discipline.
It seems to me that many instructors and even textbook authors have a tendency to present material defensively. What I mean by that is their feeling is that if they fail to present complete content or even state-of-the-art content, that others would be critical of them for not presenting a good course or a good body of information. It's sort of a positive feedback loop, because what happens is then uh, they keep pushing more and more content, and what happens is the courses become very content oriented instead of competency oriented. And as Erik said, it's the competency that we really want to shoot for here. So our objective is higher order cognitive skills. And we do that by emphasizing the story as opposed to trivial detail that could be deleted.
100%. Yep. I like to call the where we are now as a result of historical inertia, right? Textbooks get bigger and bigger and bigger, and there's more and more content, and there's this sort of like inertia from what, you know, our predecessors did when they taught it. And we're at sort of an inflection point, I think, in education and biology and physiology, where we need to change the focus. And I think vision and change, I think that was a lot of the motivation, was it's sort of like, okay, you can't learn all this, right? So we need to like focus on what are the key, you know, key core concepts, but what are the skills that students require to utilize this information effectively? And I like to define one of them as qualitative reasoning, right? That sort of ability to think about this this discipline in ways that allow you to apply it. And again, this is all coming back to that sort of like, what's the key element for that? And again, so causality. So we're going to come back to that. So what does this critical thinking in physiology look like, right? Let's get a little bit more specific. And really, it's that demonstrated comprehension of the logic of the physiological mechanisms. In other words, understanding why the dominoes fall in the order they fall, or even why certain dominoes need to exist for that particular mechanism to occur, right? And then secondarily, prediction of outcomes of that normal process in an unperturbed scenario, right? What is it maintaining, let's say, in the case of a homeostatic process? But even more importantly, probably, at least in the clinical fields, is what happens to that system when there's a perturbation, right? And predicting outcomes is sort of the end goal of you know, student understanding in those applied scenarios, the applied clinical scenarios or applied scientific scenarios. And so that's really important.
What it really boils down to here is I think we want to teach students to depend more on logic than on rote memorization.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, it's and the way materials often presented now by textbooks and you know, other digital tools and things like that, it seems like that's the their automatic response to it is, look, here's something that emphasizes the factual content. That's what I must therefore emphasize as well. And then they end up relying on memorization rather than what we're trying to do is really shift the focus away from the specific content. Not that, again, not that content's not important, but away from the content itself and more on the relationships between those content elements. So what does critical thinking in A&P require? And so this is where we get back to that idea of causality. And I'm going to use a Scottish philosopher, David Hume here, who really was one of the original epistemological empiricists. And epistemology is a term that's relatively new to me, so I'll explain it. So epistemology is sort of like knowing how you know what you know, right? Like how do we know things? And he was pushing back against epistemological rationalists who basically said that, well, we know what we know because we can reason to it, right? We can use reasoning and logic as the chief source of knowledge. And he pushed back and said, being an empiricist, basically said, well, that doesn't always work, because what we need to do is base our reasoning and our logic on prior events, on prior information, right? And so really that just feeds in, and the basics here is that just feeds into this idea that all of scientific study is developing that prior knowledge that links causes with effects, right? There's no ability to definitively know that a cause is tied to an effect outside of the fact that they may always be tied together. There's no proof of that, but we have to make predictions that comport with reality. And if A always causes B, then we can link them as cause and effect, right? And that's really what David Hume was getting at, was this idea of the essentialness of causality. And his main point, or one of his main points, he had many, but one of his main points was that without causality, you cannot predict. And again, I keep using that word as well, right? We cannot infer, we cannot predict, which is what we want our students to be able to do, without an understanding of that causality. And so we have to make that primary in our instruction of this content so that the students are focused there, and therefore can utilize this information much more effectively. So we ended up writing a book that took us forever and a day. And really, I had no motivations to write a book outside of the fact that I had over decades come to the conclusion that I was doing things differently than a lot of people. And I was like, hey, this works, right? And I'm like trying to spread this word to say, hey, like, if you focus on the explanation rather than just the content being sequentially correct, laid out in a pretty textbook, it was more about like the explain, because everybody says, well, how's your textbook different? It's like, expect something dramatic. And it's like, well, you have to read it because it's in the explanation. It's in providing the causality such that the students can walk away with a deeper comprehension. So what are these causes? So they fall into the three main categories, as you might suspect: biological, chemical, and physical. And our point here is not that you should teach students to categorize causes into these three blocks every time they come up, but more so that students understand that these are the types of causes that link physiological elements within these cascades that we're talking about. And the key point here is that these biological, chemical, and physical causes is where all of the teaching occurs. You can tell students factual information all day long. That's not really teaching, right? Teaching is helping someone else understand something. And without a real emphasis on the in-betweens, right? What's between the dominoes as opposed to the dominoes themselves, then we're not being as effective as I think we could be, right? And so I want to give you a few specific examples here relative to an example we'll use in this discussion.
Actually, Erik and I are working on a paper right now that will explore each of these categories in a little bit more detail. Hopefully it will come out soon.
Yep. It just more detail on this whole idea, and what other examples beyond the list I'll give you here in a moment, but just sort of like giving students a ballpark of like, these are the types of things that link events in physiological actions. And so we're going to use an antidiuretic hormone cascade here, stimulus to response, as sort of our example. And just as examples of those categories, we could think of biological causes as something along the lines of changes in protein expression or changes in membrane dynamics, things like that, a signal transduction mechanism. So relative to ADH, we could think of changing expression of the aquaporin 2 in the nephron collecting duct and distal convoluted tubule in response to that hormone. In terms of a chemical cause, we could think about changing the structure of a molecule or changing the equilibrium of a chemical reaction. In the case of the ADH pathway, we could think of cyclic AMP dependent kinases causing initiating phosphorylation of that aquaporin 2 to activate it. And then finally, a physical cause example in this scenario would be the osmotic water movement across that aquaporin 2 once it's in that apical membrane, right? Now, of course, it's going to be driven by a solute gradient across that membrane. But that osmotic force is a physical force, the same as, and we could throw out some other categories here, like electrical gradients or chemical gradients, temperature changes, viscosity. There's a whole slew of things that would fall into this sort of physical category of causes. So how do we use those causes to create these lectures and discussions really with your students they're both interesting and comprehensible? And really, this is where it really light bulbs went off for me in the evolution of my teaching, because when I went in this direction much more dramatically, lecturing became far more fun and more effective. And for me, it's almost, I don't know which is better for me. Like, yes, I want to be more effective, but it's so much more fun when you're teaching and what you're teaching is a story based in logic, right? And so really what we're saying is you're creating stories of these physiological events, in any category, in any area of physiology where there's a plot, right? There's a plot, there's an end goal, an output of some sort. And it might not even be static. Well, it's usually not static. But the idea of the story is that, and how to tell that story is that it's plot focused, not character focused. It's not to say that the characters aren't important. And in fact, the students will remember the characters better if they're embedded in a plot that makes sense to them, right? I find my students remember the names and the components of the plot of the physiological cascades much better. They put them in the proper orders because they understand the order, i.e. the plot. Now, how do you get them to sort of, right? Because we want to move past the, more passive learning mechanisms to more active learning mechanisms. And one of the ways to do that is to utilize concept maps. Students love them. And when I say concept map, I'm not talking about me creating a concept map for them. I'm talking about leading them in the creation of a concept map. So they're inserting the elements and I'm helping them along the way to figure out what comes next and why. And their sense of accomplishment and what they understand and the learning tool they have once they're done is much more effective for them. They have a sense of accomplishment. They definitely have a deeper understanding of the content because of it. And they're utilizing those practice skills, that the peak of that learning pyramid, more continuously and effectively, right? I always tell them, like, just recreate the plots, not from memorization, but from logic. And so, students love it. It seems to work very well. And then the last thing here I'll throw out is that the next step really is to say, okay, here's your plot within this, functioning physiological cascade. What happens when I pull out domino 7? Right? Or what happens when I bifurcate this pathway and we add dominoes or something, right? And it's sort of like, again, if they don't understand how the dominoes are linked, they cannot predict outcomes. Only when they truly understand their linkages will they be able to then predict what happens downstream. Again, coming back to Hume's causality, got to have it.
There's actually an analogy that comes from writing that basically is another example of what Erik's talking about. When you're writing, what you want to focus on is the paragraph, not the individual words alone. We need to put things together into a story.
Sure. And again, the words alone are important, but the story has more meaning than any individual word. And there you go. All right, so let's look at our example. We have got our ADH pathway concept map here. And in this one, we've got sort of a stimulus at the top there. We've got the actions of ADH that follow. Then we have the direct actions of ADH. Then we'll have vascular effects that will follow. And then finally, cardiac effects that will change blood pressure. And so there are blocks to this, and we can utilize that. That's kind of another avenue of this. We call it chunking. But what we're saying is that this concept map is sort of like saying, well, there's the line of dominoes. They're in the proper order, but we don't really know what's connecting them. In other words, the story here is in the arrows, right? The story, yeah, is it important to get things in order? Correct, absolutely, but they won't get them in order unless they understand the story. And so again, and we're not saying that people leave out all of this story. We're just saying that it needs to be front and center all the time. Otherwise, the students see this as something to memorize. They will look at this and say, okay, I need to know those things in that order, and they will memorize it. And so you need to flip the script on them and say, okay, yes, the order is important. An understanding of the order is more important. And the only way to do that is to understand the causality, right? In other words, my note here at the bottom just says, this is all characters, no plot.
This is really a decent concept map. The problem is students are going to see this as a progression, and they're basically going to try to tackle it by memorization. It's going to be more difficult for them because they really don't understand why the various steps occur in the sequence. So like Erik's saying, we need to figure out a way to tell this more of a story that makes sense. And then students can pick up on really understanding what's going on.
And just to piggyback on that briefly, another key element to this, delivery mechanism is that you cannot separate the explanation of the cause from the effects, right? If you try to do them separately, the students don't tend to put them back together. You can't sort of lay out a map like this and then later on say, oh, and here's, Starling's law of the heart, right? They need to see it in context and what it's linking to what. And so we're just sort of pushing for this really consistent and regular use of causality in those explanations, right? Coupled with the content constantly. And, frankly, the students, in my experience, just really, they're more attentive because they're understanding it on the fly, right? Many students, right? I had, again, years ago, I didn't do this as effectively. And, I felt like, the group of students that are just like stenographers, they're just basically writing down what you're saying. It's like, I'm like, stop, right? If that's what you're doing, stop writing, right? Like, I need to get you to the point where you're understanding it. And I had to get better at linking these things, right? I had to get better for them to get better. And what I found was that the more consistently I pulled in the causality, and I mean all the time, everything is a cascade in physiology, nothing is static. So the more I did that, the better they comprehended it on the fly in the classroom. And then the better they did with their studying later on, because they weren't just sort of like, well, now I need to make sense of all this mishmash of notes that I have and 1,000 facts.
The fact is, as instructors, we're the leaders in the classroom. So we're going to dictate what the mental approach is to this material. So it's a big responsibility.
Yeah. And I know we're old, so we tend to be expository lecturers. We came from that background, but active learning, this is like you deliver the basic content and the rationale, or the basic content, at least the sequence and the overall picture, but then, build the concept map with them. And the concept map you want to build is this one, right? Now, could it be worse? Yes. It depends on the level at which you're going to teach this. It could be horrifying, right? But it's not, right? And in the end, you should see me do this on a chalkboard or a marker board, a whiteboard. It's chaos because it's not neatly written and organized. But it isn't about the end result. It's about the process of developing the story. They can neaten it up later. You can provide it, in an organized fashion later, but walking them through and having them provide, or you help them provide that causation, the elements in red here, where we're adding the in-betweens, right? The arrow explanation of the arrows is really the key to pretty much any explanation.
It's been quite a few years since I've been in the classroom, but talking with Erik about how he presented this in the spring term, uh, he said his students love this because by generating this type of concept map, including the causal linkages between steps, they could actually feel themselves getting better. They could feel themselves learning. Like Erik said, this is active learning, and this is what we want.
Yeah, and I have to say that one of my most common comments from students after a class, we have a system of student evaluation, is that they learn to think differently. They learn to study differently. And I take that as like an enormous compliment, because it's sort of like, that's my goal. I'm trying to get them to think differently about pretty much anything, right? Facts can be found on Google in a tenth of a second. The understanding of the linkage between facts, not so much, right? That's something they have to like acquire through other mechanisms, right? So what needs to give for us to accomplish this goal? Well, we need to deliver only the content level required to connect the dots. Now, again, that can vary depending upon, this is the beauty of this system. This works in a 100 level, 1 semester physiology course or med school, right? The difference is the degree of detail and the number of components you want to include. What you can't do is have steps in a process and not provide the logical linkage. It could be a simplified linkage, or it could be a complex molecular mechanism. That's up to you. But the students need something that allows them to logically link A to B and B to C and C to D. For example, in our ADH example here, we could say that ADH is a hormone, in which case maybe you're just saying, well, hormones are chemical signals that generate effects. Okay, if that's the level at which you're teaching this, then that's all you need to tell them. I tend to teach it at a level where I tell them it's a peptide hormone. And I wanted them to know it's a peptide hormone because that, based upon what I've taught them elsewhere, tells them that, okay, this is a hydrophilic hormone, not a lipophilic one. That immediately opens another door and says, oh, it's going to bind a membrane-bound receptor. It's likely going to be linked to a signal transduction mechanism of A, B, or C type, and it's going to lead to this, kind of potential change. Okay, you might want to say, oh, ADH is a nonapeptide. Well, when, like that's extraneous, unless you're going to talk about developing analogs to, block the receptor and they need to look like ADH, right? So again, a very simple example there, but, we have to filter to provide the essentials to get to the next step for them. And that's entirely up to you. What I love about this is I can use the exact same, I used our tool, the book, and I've used it at 200 level and 600 level. The only difference is the level of detail I require for those connections in between. How much do they need to understand about those details? And again, even those details have the logic that's inherent to them. It's not just more detail. There's still a rational explanation that you can provide.
So what we're really saying here is if you're going to make room for the stories and making sure the students understand the causal linkages between steps and apply logic, some of the content's going to have to go. And so it falls on us as the instructors to identify what that content is. It doesn't have to be presented, and have the discipline to not present it, to focus more on understanding and telling the story.
Yep, 100%. A good example from my own experience is that, and maybe others here, immunology, right? Immunology is its own textbook, yet it's like in every physiology book, right? So what do you do with it? Like, do you try to, cover all of it? I mean, the complexity is enormous. I had to like learn way more immunology than I ever knew to write a chapter on immunology. You can back it off to the point where you still create these logical stories, and are you leaving elements out that are just out, right? You may introduce them generally and not specifically. Yes, that could happen. But even with the elements that you do present, you just back off on the level of detail such that you provide, again, that logical explanation, the causality between things, without all the specific molecular detail that you might, provide in an immunology course. So again, it's entirely up to the instructor. And to be honest, we're doing this already. You have to filter. You can't teach everything. So you're already doing it. You're teaching at a level, you're teaching some things and not others. We're just saying content is too much in the it's so readily in the forefront that it's what students focus on. So if we don't change our emphasis consistently and scream it from the podium, they will try to turn this into, and they describe it, right? There are studies that have looked at student perception of biology courses. They describe it as an activity in memorization. That's how they see many courses. So unless you flip it so that they can't do that, that's where they're going. That's what they're good at. That's what they've been trained to do. And then you end up with people that are, trivia masters in anatomy and physiology, which is, in my mind, maybe not entirely useless, but without the other element, it kind of is useless, right? Then it is just trivia. So sort of the other side of this is that you need to align your assessment with these goals. And so we want to promote those higher order cognitive skills, the HOCs, in both formative and summative assessments. Now, first thing I'll say is that I think my perception is that you should focus on formative. One is that students find that more effective. They would rather be tested more frequently to keep them on the ball and on top of the material. I see it as, and that's good. I think that's a positive thing for both them and for me. But it's also sort of low risk training ground for the summative assessments. In other words, it's kind of like saying like, well, we have a basketball game on, at the end of the month, but we're not actually going to practice, right? I'm going to, tell you about it, but we're not actually going to do it. And then, at the end of the month, they go to play and they do terribly. So they need to practice with these higher order cognitive skills and utilizing them, so that they get better, right? Because for many of them, again, it's like a novel way of thinking, and it requires them to be sort of trained in a new skill. Here's another interesting bit of information supported by data. Assessing at higher levels, at the higher Bloom's levels, actually increases both their higher order cognitive skills and their lower, right? So assessing just at the lower level isn't as good at promoting lower level skills as assessing at the higher level. It almost seems counterintuitive, but it does, right? Remember what I was saying about this idea that like, if you put words into a paragraph and a paragraph makes perfect sense, they remember the words better, right? So the more that we can create these stories of logic, the more they will remember the components of the story, right? And so we say, I'm against the idea that lower level courses should be content focused. Sure, it might be a greater focus. Those are the easier questions. You can't just dump them into the deep end of the pool. But avoiding higher order skills, I think, is a mistake because as we're pointing out here, it actually makes them better at the lower order cognitive skills like remembering, but it also makes them better at this application of information. And remember, this is not these critical thinking skills are not domain specific. That's another one of my key points, right? Is that you're teaching them how to think, not just about physiology, but about lots of things, right? You're generating, cognitive frameworks within which to think about life's problems, if you will. And so we certainly want to do that. Remember that you can't ask predictive questions if causal logic is absent. If you don't consistently do this and you're not putting the two together, then you shouldn't ask predictive questions because only your students that are already equipped to do that will get them right. Other students will flounder. And then finally, students respond to assessment level accordingly. You know, if you raise the bar, many of them will attempt to reach that bar, right? We need to push them because, again, content masters, I should say fact masters, are not effective in clinical roles, you know, as scientists, right? They need the skills. I always think that I put the competencies above the content. Content can always be looked up. Competencies are something that's a skill set.
And that's what the MCAT and the NCLEX are looking for now, people that have those skills.
Yeah.
By the way, everything Erik just said is supported in recent literature on education. So this stuff is spot on.
And we got really lucky because we started writing this book 2012, something like that. Took us a decade. But it aligned with people that we didn't know and groups we didn't know that were already moving in this or thinking about moving in the exact same direction. And so it was just sort of a nice matchup where we said, wow, that's that's how we think about this. That's what we think is important. So in our experience or in our book, what we do to sort of push the development of these critical thinking skills, right, the practice element, is we have a tool called Can You Put It Together that's regularly inserted into the text as a way to directly assess their ability to think about something that we just explained. And there are a couple different ways to do that. In our first example here, and I won't get into too much of the details of these questions, but in the first example, it's one about pressure gradients. And in this one, it's about, you know, water flow in the pipes in your house. That is where we're asking students to generalize concept knowledge to a novel scenario, right? It's not about the heart. It's not about blood vessels. It's not about flow of air, right, in lungs, and that sort of thing. But the concept correlates with physiology, but it's not directly what we taught them. And so we give those type of examples, a novel scenario. In the second one, it's just an example of another avenue of doing this where we like to use pathophysiology, right? Pathophysiology that we don't teach the students, but we've given them the tools to think about such that they can predict outcomes, right? And so this second one is just about varicose veins and, you know, whether it's not, you know, they would lead to somebody passing out, more or less likely that they would pass out when they stand up because of changes in venous return. And so again, it's that idea, like, and there are other scenarios. You can use animal models. You can use novel, you know, made up models, alien, you know, examples, something you made up as a way to get students to think outside the box, where they're not using direct knowledge of something you taught them, but they're forced to apply what they know.
When I was a beginning faculty member and all the way through to the conclusion of my career, when I taught physiology, I always made sure I defined learning for my students. And honestly, in physiology, part of the course dealt with memory and learning. But anyway, what I used to say was that learning was the ability to recall past experiences and apply them in novel situations. I just looked up another one last night. There are many definitions to learning, but this is from Peter Brown et al. Learning, acquiring knowledge and skills and having them readily available from memory so you can make sense of future problems and opportunities. And these can you put it together questions, and basically what we've been talking about throughout this whole webinar focuses on that.
Yep, 100%. So our last slide, you made it, you survived. It's just a quick, you know, note that we do have a book out there that was written for the purpose of supporting this kind of teaching. It just aligns with how we came to find teaching most effective, right? And again, I think Jerry and I talked about this, you know, talking about this webinar before giving it, where Jerry and I both came to the conclusion, like, well, I don't know if maybe you know people like this, people that are really, really bright, sometimes they have a hard time explaining things to people because they don't understand that you don't understand, right? Well, fortunately or unfortunately, Jerry and I are not geniuses. So, and I think that really has helped us in the writing of our book and how we teach, in that I can't explain something effectively unless I really understand it, which means I have to use these same tools, these same things we've been describing for the last 45 minutes to generate those descriptions. I can't just jump, right? You don't want to jump from step A to D in your teaching if they need B and C to understand the linkage, right? So again, and sometimes, right, the students will tell you, like, I don't understand. It's like, well, maybe there's another step you left out that you should add that will make it intuitive to the student. And so, people say, well, why did it take so damn long to write a book? And I'm like, well, because I had to wrap my brain around, we're not experts in all areas. Physiologists in general don't tend to be experts in everything, right? But I felt like I had to, at least try to become an expert in everything to get to the level at which I could explain it from the basis of its logic. And so anyway, so that's what's in our book. That's, why we wrote it. And again, we're just really trying to create sort of a pedagogical shift in how biology and physiology specifically is taught, to make it more effective, to make the students more competent in the application of this material, both inside, in their fields, but also in life. I think that's a big element for me, is teaching students how to think logically and rationally about anything is a plus.
Like Erik says, neither of us are geniuses. I'm going to embarrass you a little bit, Erik.
Uh,
Erik doesn't have to use notes anymore. I think he did earlier in his career, but he doesn't now. And the reason he doesn't need them is he has a story. He walks into the classroom with a story. And I'm going to embarrass myself also. I'm not a genius either. Uh, I never had to use notes in my career after the very first lecture I gave in 1975. And it's because I had to depend upon the story. And when I walked into the room, all I basically did was tell that story. And something, teaching anatomy and physiology became really fun. It's fun if you do it this way.
100%. I agree. Well, folks, really appreciate you all joining us. Really enjoyed giving that.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much. That was really informative. And just an exciting way to hear how, again, physiology can be something that, is fun for the teacher as well as the student. And just how students can really like see themselves improve. But I'll go ahead and open it up for some questions if people have any. One that we do have come up is if I'm going to shift focus to kind of more an enhanced explanation of causality elements in my lectures, that's going to take more time. So how do you determine what content maybe you're going to de-emphasize in order to get these explanations in?
Yeah, thanks, Megan. That's a really great question, because it's a mental battle. If you're like Jerry and I, and Jerry especially, Jerry does not like to cut content. He never liked to cut content. Um, but we have to realize that the hard truth is that you can't teach it all, and that you need to back off. So you need to find out what you need to think about, what your students need content wise, right? And the answer is cannot be everything, right? You can't just say, well, they need all of it. They need all of those 1,300 pages. They don't. Um, then you're not being realistic, because they just it's like you have to cherry pick to a degree, and then you have to emphasize, de-emphasize, right? Like I said about immunology, I haven't cut it out, but I've de-emphasized it to the point where, or simplified, I should say. It's still really important, and they still have to understand like very complex relationships, but without all the detail necessarily, right? They have to understand the gist of immunology, right? And so again, repackaging that sometimes is a bit of a challenge, but it's what we need to do. We can't just continue to grow our courses content-wise, because in the end, you're going to end up teaching less and less, not more and more. And so, I know that's not a fantastic answer, but I think the answer is, it needs to align with what your students need in terms of where they're going, what they're going to, require. But also, that upon doing that, you stay true to the model, right? With everything that you are teaching. I'd rather teach them 5 topics really well so that they can think about those than 7 and they turned it into a memorization marathon.
I'll echo that and say also having the ability and the desire to do that comes with the job description that we have as instructors. So if we really care about our students and their futures and their ability to think with higher order cognitive skills, we're gonna bite the bullet and learn how to do this. It's not easy.
Excellent, thank you. We have another question here. How do you come up with the stories? Brianna says, I really struggle to create scenarios related to physiology topics.
Yeah, that's a good one. I, well, maybe I can say one thing is that I tell people with this when, about our book, is that, like, I know that that's a hard part. I had to live it, right? It's like, in other words, I had to understand immunology, which is tough, to the point at which I could explain it from the basis of its logic. And so I think you need, if you don't have it already, but find those resources that will provide. All the time I say, I wrote this book, Jerry and I wrote this book. I was primary author. Jerry was my, like, editor master. But we wrote this for as much for instructors as for students, maybe more so, right? I mean, certainly I think students will benefit from it because it does give the explanation. But you can't, this question I think infers, it's like you can't teach this way unless you have the stories. And you don't have the stories if you don't have the full picture of, like, what logically links to what, right? And again, that's what I went digging for years, to sort of, like, create the stories, the logical linkage of elements. So I think, it's tough, right? Like, there are a lot of people that use, as Jerry's mentioning, a lot of people that use tools when they teach their notes or their PowerPoints. And I know it's a tough thing to do, but if you do that, I really push you to gradually move away from them. Because the more you move away from them, the more your lectures become organic, the more you start to tell a story. And the more, and I know you have, and I was forced into being a content expert to the point where that was easier for me. But it's now in the pages of this. So, whether you use it in class or not, I still think it's a good way for people to find the stories so they can back away from the other elements that put them in more lockstep with the content, as opposed to being able to tell an organic story. Like, what's the point? Like, let's do blood pressure regulation. What do we need? Like, right? You're just laying out what are the components, what are the goals, how is it done? What are the logic of the cascades? Again, it's not easy, but it's so worthwhile. Like, teaching is
I use,
infinitely more fun
oh,
for me
sorry.
now. Sorry, go ahead, Jerry.
What I used to do was after I had the lecture pretty much put together, before I would try to walk in the classroom and deliver it to the students, I would take a blank sheet of paper and from memory, I would write down the major topics and even the subtopics that I planned to cover. And I would force myself to think through what I could say that would, like, naturally lead from one topic or from one bit of information to the next. And if I couldn't do that, that meant I didn't have the story complete in my mind. And so I wouldn't give up until I could do that. And then, giving the lecture was simply a matter of walking in the classroom, telling the story, and having fun.
Yeah, but I get, like, I would recommend, if you don't do that and you use a lot of guides when you're teaching, is to do it incrementally. You can't just go whole hog, right? It took me, whatever, if you want to go all the way, it took me 35 years to get to this point, right? But really in the last, I'd say 10 to 15, it's like incrementally, like I was like, man, PowerPoints just aren't for me. It ties me into a picture that's already here. I can't change it. And so I walk in with a handful of pens and an idea. And do I need the content knowledge to support, like Jerry said, do I need the story in my head? Sure. But remember, once you have the story, the players are logical. Then it's easier to remember, right? What we're trying to instill in our students, it's easier to remember this stuff if you have the story. So, once you can get the story, then telling it becomes logical as opposed to, what's next on my list, and, make sure I don't forget to say this. No, you have to say this because it's essential to what comes next, right? And just the more you do that, the more you try to do that, the more it'll become natural to do it.
Folks, if Erik and I can do this, you can too.
What are you trying to say, Jerry?
I think.
Joanna would like to know, who would you say is the intended audience for your text?
That's a good question because, we wrote it for this sort of like middle level, undergrad, like, not a senior level course, but maybe not in certainly, it's not a 1 semester physiology textbook. I would put it at, the level of, I don't know, there's a couple different books, Costanzo and Silverthorne and a few others that are sort of like right at that, intermediate level. But again, here's the point that I would like to make. I've used this everywhere from 200 level to 600 level. It's just a matter of, and granted, you have to like you have to have the students like follow what you teach, right? Every textbook has more in it than you can teach, right? So the students have to follow what you teach as their guideline for what to focus on and work on and understand.
Yeah.
But the stories are there. So if the logic is there, whether you simplify the logic or give me more details in the logic is up to you, right? And so again, I think, it's written at the level for, undergrad intro level with an intro, bio and an intro chem course as sort of prerequisites. But I think you could use it, especially above, you could use it for a lot of levels beyond that, where you just require more application and greater, focus on the details.
I would want people to understand that our book is loaded with content, but it's not unnecessary content. It's all content that's part of telling the story.
Yeah, it's funny. Let me piggyback on that real quickly, because I've had people say, oh, this book is harder, or a higher level than a certain book. And I'm like, there's no more detail in this book than these other books that, people are comparing it to. Literally, there's probably more detail in the books that I mentioned. What there's more of in this book is explanation, right? There's more of the linking, giving the why, so that you're not left with, okay, this happens and this happens and this happens and this happens. And it's like, okay, you got to go from A to Z and there's 26 things in a row I need to remember. And there's really not a coherent, at least, story connecting them. I think that makes it harder, right? Not easier. Yeah, there's less explanation, but what are you learning, right? The whole point is like, what are you trying to instill in your students? If the goal is an ability to apply not the higher level blooms, right? Analyze and evaluate and apply. If that's your goal, and it probably should be, if that's your goal, then they need the explanations. They need the causative linkages between these things. And without that explanation, you're left with the encyclopedic versions of books, which are accurate and complete, and in my mind, not very effective, because
Things that you
don't
will not
support what I'm
remember,
trying to do in the classroom.
and you're not going to remember that material down the road because it doesn't tie in with anything.
Yeah, well, again, use the analogy, right? I give you 100 words to memorize, right? 2 days from now, I'm going to test you. You need to recall as many of those 100 words as you can, right? You're going to fail, right? You're going to do really poorly. Okay, I'm going to take the same 100 words and I'm going to construct a paragraph. I'm going to test you. What are those 100 words on, 2 days from now? A, you're going to do a lot better in remembering what those words were. But B, you learned something else. You learned something bigger than the individual words. You learned the meaning of the paragraph that I constructed with them. That's the emphasis. That's the goal of what we're trying to promote here, right? Is a story that provides more than the individual elements.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you guys again so much for your time. And then if we didn't get to your questions today, please feel free to reach out to myself and I can pass things along, or to reach out to Erik and Jerry directly, and they'd love to get in contact with you. But thanks again so much for your time. Erik and Jerry, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. Really appreciated it. And just wanted to read a quick little praise from Heidi. I appreciate this step back of thinking about how to handle content versus teaching. Really need to think about how I change my strategy.
Great, love it. And by all means, if you have other questions, my email's at the bottom there. Happy to talk offline.
So, well, thanks everyone. Again, the recording's going to be coming to you in the coming days. Have a wonderful day and a happy start to your college semesters.
Thanks, everyone.